The late theologian and pastor Daniel Erlander says, "The Bible is the story of God's unfolding promise to mend the entire universe." That the sweep of the Bible story really is as big as the world, bigger even than the whole world. I want to ask us to keep that in mind as this summer we continue a series we just started last Sunday in our adult forum after worship, journeying through the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. It can be really easy to get bogged down in the particular details of the laws of Leviticus, or the long chains of genealogies in the book of Numbers, or names and places that sound foreign and strange to us, and ancient practices and customs. It's easy to, lose the forest for the trees. But in our first session this last week, we started with that really, really big picture. That the whole sweep of the Bible is about God's unfolding promise to mend the entire universe, and that in particular, what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures is a part of that story, maybe even the opening 2/3 of that story, of how God begins to put the universe back together through the strange, surprising, peculiar, particular story of the people of Israel, from the gatherings of their patriarchs and matriarchs from foreign lands until they become a nation of people enslaved as refugees in Egypt, until they enter into a land of their own and are freed from slavery, to what it's like to be people on their own, surrounded by other nations and peoples who do things differently, even through exile and back. All of it pushing forward, leading toward, in a surprising way, Christians say, the arrival of Jesus on the scene, who continues that very same work of God to mend the entire universe. As we go forward in this series, we're going to take a closer look at different books and sections of the whole Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. But a couple of things to say at the beginning as an overview. We talked about how there are slight differences in the way Christians classically think about or categorize these books, these texts, and the way our Jewish neighbors do. But they're basically trying to do the same thing. There's the first 5 books that are sometimes called the Torah, or maybe you're familiar with calling them the Pentateuch, or the books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. These are books that certainly tell the story of how this people of Israel comes to be, from the ancestors Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and all the tribes of Jacob's children, and then also what it's like for that people to go through the experience of slavery and liberation, and how to be a free people, how to live in relationship with God as an alternative to what they had lived through in slavery in Egypt. That story and all the twists and turns along the way, and the description of here's how we're going to live as freed people, that's at the heart of the Torah. Then we Christian readers will often have a section in our Old Testaments that we sometimes call the historical accounts. The traditional way in Judaism of talking about them is the former prophets, but these would be stories about life after the people go into the land that they had been promised. The story of Joshua and Judges, and Ruth is in there as a delightful romantic comedy. The books of Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah. These are books that tell stories about what happened when this king was in charge and what happened during this person's reign, but they also do so from a particular perspective. One of the things I think we're going to discover is the writers of, say, Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, they don't judge a king or a ruler or even a time period by whether the markets were up and people were prosperous or their territory was expanded, but more, were they living in the faithful covenant way of God? Were they practicing justice and mercy? Were they loving their neighbor? Were they doing right to one another and not cheating each other? That seems to be a more interesting, more important criterion. So it's a particular lens on living through those periods of history. So we get those historical stories. Then we get a section that Christians collectively call the wisdom and poetry. In Hebrew, these are often just called the Ketuvim, the writings. And this would include poems and prayers like the Psalms, and wise sayings like the Proverbs. It would include sort of reflective philosophical treatises like Ecclesiastes, or what almost feels like existentialist theater in the book of Job. All of these are sort of reflections on how do we find meaning? What's the purpose? What's the good life in the midst of living in relationship with this God? And then the other category is the prophets. In Hebrew, they're called the Nevi'im, and this would include longer books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. and shorter books who are called the minor prophets, not because they're less important, but because the writings we have from them are shorter. So we've got a collection of 12 of those writers like Amos and Micah and Hosea and Nahum, a whole variety of them as well. All of those together give us different angles, different windows on what it means to live in this story of the God who is intending to mend all of the universe, and who's chosen to do it not by forcing or tyrannically coercing the world, but working through the story of this people, the people of Israel, who are meant to live in a different way, whose very lives and community are supposed to point to the character of God. And as God cares for and provides for these people, they're supposed to be a living example for the world of, I want to be in relationship with this God as well. All of that is the story that we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Certainly, it's going to be important for us to know those stories to understand what's going on with Jesus. But Jesus himself takes all of his cues for who he is and what he's supposed to be from the scriptures, the Bible that he read. So not only does Jesus help us understand the Old Testament helps us understand Jesus. And all of it as part of this big, vast story of God's intention to put all things right in the whole world, in fact, in the whole universe. We're going to zoom back in and start back at the beginning, taking a look at Genesis this coming Sunday in Adult Forum, as making our way through those first 5 books of the Torah. We invite you to join us Sunday by Sunday after worship here at Community of Christ for this series in our Adult Forum. See you as we journey through the Old Testament and Hebrew Bible.